The high-pitched, rhythmic scream of the pulse oximeter sliced through the luxury lobby like a serrated blade, each beep becoming more frantic than the last. Oxygen's dropping. A voice called out over the din, the words devoid of emotion but heavy with the weight of impending disaster. William Thornton watched from his knees, his tailored suit ignored as he stared at the small, stiff form of his son, Benjamin, lying on the cold marble floor. The numbers on the portable monitor were plummeting, 70, 68, 65, as the baby's chest strained against a throat that refused to open. In that moment of absolute crisis, the medical team did something that felt like a betrayal to a father who had spent his life buying solutions. They stepped back. Dr. Carson, a man with decades of prestige, held his hands up in a gesture of agonizing restraint. Laryngospasm, he explained, his eyes fixed on the infant's pale, dry lips. If we force the mask now, the reflex could kill him. We have to wait for the airway to release on its own. Wait. William's voice was a jagged tear in the sterile air. You're telling me to watch him die? He looked at the circle of white coats, the world-class specialists he paid millions to maintain, and saw nothing but educated hesitation. They were bound by protocol, by the fear of a lawsuit, and by the very textbooks that told them the risks of intervention were too high. To them, Benjamin was a patient with a physiological lock. To William, he was his entire world fading into a terrifying shade of blue. But there was someone else in the lobby who didn't care about lawsuits or medical boards. Kesha Williams stood just beyond the perimeter of the frantic doctors, her small hands clutching a bright green plastic cup. She was 10 years old, her clothes were stained with the dust of the streets, and her heart was still hammering from being chased by security guards who thought she was a thief. She had seen this look before, not in a hospital, but in the cramped, hot apartments of her neighborhood where the air was thick and the help was always too far away. She watched the doctors' faces and saw the wait that she knew led to a casket. Where she came from, waiting was a luxury that the poor couldn't afford. She looked at the baby's dry tongue and the way his tiny body arched, and a memory of her mother's voice flickered in her mind, a lesson in survival that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with the raw instinct of life. While the alarms reached a fever pitch and the doctors shared a look of grim resignation, Kesha moved. She didn't ask for permission, and she didn't wait for a consensus. She dropped to her knees on the marble floor, her frayed jeans a sharp contrast to the polished stone. "Hey, stop!" a security guard shouted, his hand reaching for her shoulder, but he was too slow. Kesha was already there, leaning over the billionaire's son with an intensity that silenced the room. She tilted Benjamin's head with a gentle, practiced hand, not too far, just enough, and tipped the green cup. A thin, steady stream of cool water hit the baby's lips, splashing against the dry skin and pooling at the corners of his mouth. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The shock of the water triggered the very reflex the doctors had been waiting for. Benjamin's body jerked, his lungs desperate for the air that had been denied to them, and he let out a gagging sound that transformed into a raw, piercing cry. It was the most beautiful sound William Thornton had ever heard. As the oxygen monitors began to climb and the doctors rushed back in to take over, Kesha pulled away, the empty green cup still in her hand. She looked at the billionaire, who was now sobbing into his hands, and then at the doctors who were staring at her as if she had just performed a miracle. She hadn't meant to be a hero, she just knew that in the world she lived in, you did what you had to do before the clock ran out. The luxury hospital lobby was a cathedral of glass and silent efficiency, a place where the air usually smelled of expensive lilies and high-end antiseptic, until the moment the world stopped for William Thornton. It didn't start with a crash or a scream. It began with a terrifying, hollow stillness. William was a man who moved markets with a phone call and commanded thousands with a nod, But as he stood near the fountain with his 1-year-old son, Benjamin, all that power evaporated into the sterile atmosphere. He had been looking down, adjusting the silk of his tie, when he noticed the tugging had stopped. Benjamin, usually a bundle of restless energy in his bright red onesie, had gone unnervingly quiet. William pulled back to look at his son's face, expecting a playful pout or a sleepy blink, but what he saw froze the blood in his veins. The boy's eyes were half open, staring toward a point somewhere behind William's shoulder, unfocused and glazed like marble. His lips, once a healthy rose, were beginning to take on a dry, bluish pallor. William didn't shout immediately. His first instinct was the cold, surgical control that had made him a billionaire. He adjusted his grip, whispering his son's name with a forced calm that didn't reach his racing heart. Then came the sound, a faint, rhythmic clicking in the back of the infant's throat. It wasn't a cough or a cry, but the sound of air failing to find a path. In a heartbeat, the billionaire's composure shattered. "I need help now," he roared, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. The lobby, which had been a haven of quiet wealth, exploded into a frantic, disjointed choreography. Doctors and paramedics who had been walking with measured strides suddenly broke into a run, their footsteps thundering across the polished floor. A gurney was whipped around a corner, the wheels shrieking against the stone, but as the medical team reached him, Benjamin's body suddenly stiffened. He arched back in William's arms, his small spine curving like a bow before he went completely limp. Fearing the delay of even a few seconds to lift him onto the gurney, William dropped to his knees right there on the hospital floor. He lowered his son onto the cold marble, the bright red fabric of the onesie looking like a drop of blood against the vast white expanse of the lobby floor. Gloved hands blurred into his vision as the specialists surrounded them, their faces masked in the terrifying calm of professional crisis. "Oxygen's dropping," a voice called out, sharp and mechanical, as the leads were attached to the child's tiny chest. The pulse oximeter began its frantic high-pitched scream, a sound that sliced through William's soul. He was backed away by a nurse, his hands shaking so violently he had to clench them into fists to hide the tremor. He watched as Dr. Carson, the head of pediatrics, leaned over the boy, checking his airway with a practiced light touch. The diagnosis came like a death sentence whispered in the middle of a riot. Laryngospasm. The baby's airway had locked shut. A reflex designed to protect him was now suffocating him. To William's horror, the doctors stepped back, their hands hovering but not touching. "Forcing it could kill him," Carson said, his voice tight with the agony of protocol. "We have to wait." Waiting. It was a concept William Thornton had never accepted. He looked at his son, whose oxygen levels were now plummeting to 70, then 68, on the monitors. The silence of the baby was louder than the screaming alarm. In the middle of the most expensive hospital in the city, surrounded by the best minds money could buy, the billionaire realized with a sickening clarity that his son was dying on the floor while the experts stood by and watched the clock. The terror was no longer silent, it was a physical weight, crushing the air out of his own lungs as he watched the light begin to fade from the only thing in the world he truly loved. The sterile, sun-drenched halls of St. Jude's were never meant for someone like Kesha Williams. As the billionaire's world collapsed in the center of the lobby, Kesha was already a shadow moving along the periphery, her existence defined by the need to remain unnoticed. At 10 years old, she possessed the hollow-eyed weariness of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes, her thin frame draped in a beige t-shirt that bore the gray smudges of the city streets. Her blue jeans were frayed at the knees, the white threads hanging like small desperate flags of surrender, and her braided hair was pulled back with a tightness that spoke of a mother's hurried affection before a long shift. Kesha hadn't come to the hospital for a checkup or a consultation. She had come because the world outside was hot, and she was desperately thirsty. She had followed her mother to work that morning, a routine born of necessity when rent fell short, and childcare was a luxury they couldn't afford. While her mother moved through the upper floors with a mop and a bucket, Kesha had been told to sit quietly in the break room. But the walls had started to close in, and the judgmental glares of the staff made her feel like a stain on the pristine linoleum. She had wandered out in search of a water station, her hand gripping a bright green plastic cup, the only thing she truly owned in that moment. It was a cheap, neon-colored thing, out of place among the glass and chrome, but it was hers. However, in a place built on the foundations of extreme wealth, a girl who looks like she belongs to the pavement is automatically viewed as a predator. The security team didn't see a thirsty child, they saw a trespasser, a potential thief wondering where she didn't belong. The accusation had been sharp and immediate. "Hey! What are you doing here?" a voice had boomed, followed by the heavy thud of boots on the floor. Panic, cold and instinctive, had surged through her. Kesha knew what happened to kids from her neighborhood when they were caught in places they weren't supposed to be. She didn't stay to explain. She ran until her chest burned with a fire that no air could put out, dodging through corridors and ducking behind pillars, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had doubled back toward the main lobby, hoping to lose the guards in the crowd, only to stumble into the middle of a nightmare. The chase had slowed as she saw the circle of white coats and the man on his knee. She stood frozen, a ghost in the hallway, watching the billionaire's son turn blue, while the doctors stood paralyzed by their own rule. She was a girl the world tried to erase, a child who had been chased like an animal only minutes before, yet she was the only one in the room who truly understood what it meant when time ran. The rhythmic shriek of the heart monitor reached a fever pitch, a jagged sound that tore through the sterile air of the lobby. William Thornton remained on his knees, his hands hovering over his son Benjamin, as if he could physically pull the life back into the boy's body. The digital readout on the portable screen was a plummeting death sentence, 64-6. Every nerve in William's body screamed for action, for a surge of power or money, to break the silence of his son's lungs. But the men in white coats, the men who cost him millions, were moving in the wrong direction. They were stepping back. Carson, his face a mask of practiced, agonizing restraint, held his gloved hands up as if surrendering to the inevitable. "Explain this," William roared, his voice cracking with a desperation he had never known in any boardroom. "Why are you standing there? Do something." He looked at the medical team, his eyes wild, searching for a hero, but he found only a circle of experts, paralyzed by their own brilliance. "It's a laryngospasm," Dr. Carson said, his voice tight, struggling to maintain the distance required by his rank. His vocal cords have seized shut. "It's a protective reflex his body has engaged, but it's locked. If we force an intubation tube down now, or if we try to pump air through that resistance, we risk a total rupture. We could cause a permanent trauma that would kill him instantly. So you're telling me to wait?" William's question was a jagged shard of glass. He looked down at Benjamin, whose tiny fingers were no longer clenching, whose red onesie seemed to grow brighter as his skin grew paler. "You're telling me the world's best doctors are going to watch a 1-year-old die on a marble floor because of a protocol? We have to wait for the spasm to fatigue," another doctor whispered, glancing nervously at the security guards who were closing off the lobby. "Once the muscles tire, the airway will relax on its own. It's the only safe way." But safety was a relative term to a father watching the light go out of his child's eyes. The wait felt like a slow-motion execution. William saw the numbers on the monitor dip into the 50s. The doctors were speaking in the language of textbooks and liability, calculating the odds of a lawsuit versus the odds of a miracle, while the clock in William's head ticked toward zero. He realized with a sickening, hollow dread that their education had made them cautious at the exact moment his son needed them to be brave. The fatal hesitation was setting in, a thick, invisible fog of indecision that was suffocating Benjamin just as surely as his own throat was. Kesha stood frozen, in the deep, velvet shadows of a decorative pillar,
her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that mirrored the dying rhythm of the infant on the floor. She was a ghost in the machinery of the hospital, a girl whose presence was usually treated as a problem to be solved, or a mess to be cleared away. From her vantage point, she could see the doctors, the men and women with the clean white coats, and the expensive degrees, stepping back, their faces pale under the harsh LED lights. She heard their words, the long, complicated names for death, and she saw the billionaire's hands shaking, as he realized his money couldn't buy his son another second of air. But while the doctors saw a medical impossibility and the father saw a tragedy, Kesha saw something else entirely. She saw the way the baby's tongue was pulled slightly back, the specific, waxy tension in his jaw, and the way his tiny chest seemed to be fighting an invisible weight. It wasn't a textbook case to her, it was a memory. It was the silver choke, or what her grandmother called the locked breath. She remembered a summer night in her own neighborhood, the air so thick you could feel it in your lungs, when her neighbor's baby had turned that same terrifying shade of blue on a porch step. The doctors there hadn't come for a long time, and the neighborhood didn't have monitors to screen for them. Instead, she had watched her mother and the older women work with a frantic, rhythmic certainty. They didn't wait for fatigue or protocol. They knew that once the body decided to stop, it needed a shock to remember how to start. She remembered her mother pouring cool water from a tin cup, not to drown the child, but to startle the nerves, to force the throat to swallow and break the seal. It was a street remedy, something born of desperation and the knowledge that in her world, if you waited for permission, you were already too late. Kesha looked down at the bright green plastic cup in her hand, the water inside still trembling from her own feet. She looked back at the baby in the red onesie, whose fingers were now limp on the marble. The doctors were still talking, their voices low and urgent as they debated the risks of a tube, but Kesha knew they were wrong. They were treating the baby like a machine that had broken down, but she knew he was a life that was simply stuck. The recognition was a cold, sharp spike through her chest. She was the only one in this room of geniuses who knew how to unlock that breath, and she realized that if she didn't step out of the shadows, the baby would never leave that floor. The digital alarm on the monitor shifted from a rhythmic pulse to a flat, unrelenting wail, signaling that Benjamin's oxygen levels had crossed a threshold from which few infants return. The doctors stood like statues in a gallery of grief, their hands held up in a gesture of scientific surrender. William Thornton's face was buried in his palms, his shoulders shaking with the silent, tectonic sobs of a man who realized that his billion-dollar empire was powerless against a locked throat. The air in the lobby was thick with the suffocating weight of waiting, a heavy, clinical silence that Kesha Williams knew was the sound of a life ending. She didn't think about the consequences, the trespass charges, or the heavy boots of the men who had been chasing her. She only thought about the locked breath, and the cool weight of the green plastic cup in her hand. Breaking from the shadows of the marble pillar, Kesha lunged forward, her frayed sneakers squeaking sharply against the polished floor, a sound that cut through the low murmurs of the medical team. "Hey! Get back," one of the security guards roared, his voice booming as he spotted the girl he had been hunting. He lunged for her, his hand missing her t-shirt by an inch as she dove onto her knees beside the baby. Dr. Carson turned, his eyes wide with horror, as he saw the street urchin, suddenly invading his sterile perimeter. "Don't touch him. You'll kill him," he shouted, reaching out to pull her away. Kesha didn't flinch. She was faster than their protocol and more desperate than their fear. With a hand that was surprisingly steady for a 10-year-old, she tilted Benjamin's head back, not with the tentative touch of a surgeon, but with the raw, focused intent of a sister. Before the guard could tackle her, before the doctors could seize her arms, she tipped the bright green cup. A thin crystalline stream of water arched through the air and splashed directly onto the infant's dry bluish lips. It wasn't enough to drown him, but it was exactly enough to shock the nerve. For a terrifying heartbeat, the room went absolutely silent as the water pooled in the corners of the baby's mouth. The guard's hand clamped onto Kesha's shoulder, ready to yank her backward, but he froze when he heard it. A violent, wet gagging sound erupted from the floor. Benjamin's body, which had been as stiff as a board, jerked with a sudden primitive electricity. The laryngospasm, the lock that all the billionaire's money couldn't pick, snapped open under the simple shock of the water. The baby's chest heaved, his lungs expanding with a frantic, desperate rush of air, and then a cry tore through the lobby. It wasn't a weak whimper. It was a loud, angry, life-affirming scream that echoed off the glass ceiling. The security guard let go of Kesha's shoulder, his mouth hanging open. Dr. Carson dropped to his knees, not to push the girl away, but to stare at the monitor as the oxygen levels began to climb with miraculous speed. William Thornton looked up from his hands, his eyes wild and tear-streaked, seeing his son breathing, crying and fighting. In the middle of it all stood Kesha, the empty green cup resting on the marble, trembling as the reality of her unthinkable act finally crashed over her. The raw, piercing scream of Benjamin Thornton shattered the clinical paralysis of the lobby, a sound so violent and life-affirming that it seemed to vibrate the very glass walls of the hospital. The digital wail of the heart monitor, which had been a flat line of despair, suddenly transformed into a rhythmic, frantic gallop as the oxygen saturation numbers surged upward on the screen. The airway, which had been a sealed vault just seconds before, had snapped open under the primitive shock of the water, allowing a desperate rush of air to flood the infant's lungs. For a moment, the entire room, the elite surgeons, the frozen security guards, and the billionaire father stood in a state of absolute breathless silence, as if the world itself had stopped to listen to the baby's cry. William Thornton remained on his knees, but his posture had shifted from the rigidity of grief to a trembling, disbelief-fueled collapse. He watched as his son's chest heaved, the bright red onesie now stained with the water from the green cup, a small and messy testament to a miracle that bypassed every medical protocol. The billionaire's hands, which had been buried in his face in a gesture of final surrender, now reached out tentatively, as if he were afraid the child might vanish if he touched him. The tears that fell were no longer silent. They were the heavy, ragged sobs of a man who had seen the end and been given a second chance by a girl he had never even noticed. Dr. Carson was the first to move, his professional shock giving way to a frantic, renewed energy. He didn't push Kesha away this time. He knelt beside her, his eyes darting between the baby's pinkening face and the rapidly climbing numbers on the monitor. "He's breathing strongly," the doctor whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and professional humility. He checked Benjamin's pulse and the clarity of his lungs, realizing that the fatigue they had been waiting for had been bypassed by a 10-year-old's instinct. There was no miracle of science here, just a perfect collision of risk and timing that had achieved what millions of dollars in equipment could not. Kesha Williams remained frozen on her knees, the empty green plastic cup still held in a white-knuckled grip. The adrenaline that had fueled her unthinkable act was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow terror. She looked at the doctors who were now swarming over the baby with stethoscopes and oxygen masks, and she looked at the security guards who were still standing just a few feet away, their faces a mask of confusion. She had broken the rules of the rich, invaded their sterile circle, and ignored their commands. As the baby's cries began to soften into a steady, healthy whimper, Kesha whispered a shaky apology to no one in particular, her eyes wide with the realization of what she had just. The tension in the lobby shifted instantly from medical crisis to a sharp clinical hostility, as the immediate threat to the baby's life receded. The two security guards, who had been momentarily paralyzed by the shock of the baby's recovery, moved forward with a rigid, narrow focus on the girl who had broken their perimeter. To them, Kesha Williams wasn't a savior. She was a trespasser, a liability, and a chaotic variable that had humiliated their security protocols. One guard, a man with a heavy jaw and a badge that caught the sterile light, reached down and grabbed Kesha's arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. The green plastic cup clattered onto the marble, spinning in a lonely circle before coming to a rest. "You're coming with us," the guard growled, his voice a harsh contrast to the soft, rhythmic beeping of the stabilized monitors. "You interfered with a medical emergency and entered a restricted zone. You're under arrest." Kesha flinched, her small frame trembling under the weight of his grip. She didn't fight back. She had spent her life learning that when men in uniforms decided you were a problem, your voice didn't matter. Her eyes, wide and glassed with unshed tears, darted toward the exit, looking for the shadows she had just abandoned. But the arrest was cut short by a voice that carried the authority of a man who owned the very ground they stood on. "Take your hands off her." William Thornton stood up, his face still wet with tears but his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. He stepped between Kesha and the guard, his presence an immovable wall of wealth and fury. The guard hesitated, his grip loosening just a fraction. "Sir, she violated hospital policy." The guard stammered, confused by the billionaire's intervention. "She could have killed him. If she hadn't been here, my son would be dead," William replied, his voice low and dangerous. "She didn't interfere. She did what your policy couldn't. If you touch her again, I will make sure you never work in this city again." Behind him, Carson straightened up from the gurney, where they were preparing Benjamin for transport. The doctor looked at the guard, then at Kesha, and finally at the billionaire. The professional embarrassment of being outperformed by a child was visible in the set of his jaw, but the truth was undeniable. "The man is right," Carson said firmly, adjusting his stethoscope. "The patient is breathing because of her. She stays under my care as a patient herself. She's dehydrated and in shock." The guards backed away, their faces reddening with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration, as they realized the power dynamic had completely inverted. They had spent the last 20 minutes hunting a thief, only to find that the billionaire they were supposed to protect was now protecting her. William Thornton didn't look at the guards as they retreated. He looked down at Kesha, who was staring at him as if he were a stranger from another planet. For the first time, the billionaire and the girl from the streets were standing on the same side of the line, shielded by a miracle that had cost nothing but a cup of water and a moment of unthinkable courage. The sterile silence of examination room 4 was a sharp contrast to the chaotic thunder of the lobby. Kesha sat on the edge of the high paper-covered table, her feet dangling several inches above the floor. She was wrapped in a thin, scratchy hospital blanket that seemed to swallow her small frame, making her look even younger than her 10 years. Her hands, finally clean of the street dust, were wrapped around a carton of apple juice, as if it were a precious relic. Across from her sat William Thornton. He had declined a chair, choosing instead to lean against the counter, his expensive wool coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal wrists that were still trembling. For a long time, neither of them spoke. William watched the way she sipped the juice, slowly, methodically, as if she were trying to make the moment last forever. He looked at her frayed sneakers resting on the footrest, and felt a surge of shame, so potent it felt physical. He realized that if he had passed this girl on the street an hour ago, he wouldn't have just ignored her. He would have mentally categorized her as a nuisance, a shadow to be avoided. He had built his entire life on the ability to see value in things others missed, yet he had been completely blind to the person who held his son's life in her hands.
"Why did you do it?" William asked finally, his voice sounding hollow in the small room. He wasn't asking as a billionaire or a father, but as a man trying to understand a bravery he wasn't sure he possessed. "The guards were chasing you. You could have just kept running. You could have stayed hidden." Kesha looked up, her eyes dark and unnervingly steady. "He was a baby," she said simply, as if that were the only logic that mattered in the world. "In my neighborhood, we don't have all these machines. We don't have time to wait for the spasm to go away. My mama always told me that when someone can't breathe, you don't wait for permission to help them. Waiting is what kills people like us." The words hit William like a physical blow. He thought of the minutes he had spent watching Doc Carson hesitate, the minutes he had spent trusting in a system that was designed for safety but optimized for stagnation. He realized that Kesha's life had taught her a truth that his billions had shielded him from. That survival is often a matter of seconds, not protocols. He began to ask her about her mother, about the aunt's apartment, and the cure route stories she remembered from her grandmother. As she spoke, the invisible girl began to take on a terrifyingly clear shape. She spoke of hunger that felt like a dull ache, of being chased out of parks, and of the way people looked through her as if she were made of glass. "I tried to tell the guards I just wanted water," Kesha whispered, her fingers picking at a loose thread on the hospital blanket, but they didn't listen. Nobody ever listens to kids like me until we do something wrong. William closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold cabinetry. He thought of his own security detail, the men he paid to keep the shallows of the world away from his ivory tower. He had been the architect of the very walls that almost cost him his son. He looked at Kesha, really looked at her, and saw the brilliance and the courage that had been forged in a fire he had never had to touch. "I spent my whole life looking past people like you, Kesha," he said, his voice thick with a raw, honest regret. "I thought I was protecting my world, but I was just making it smaller. And today, your world saved mine." The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who owned half the skyline was being humbled by a girl who didn't even have a permanent bed. As Dr. Carson entered to check her vitals one last time, William made a silent vow. The invisible girl was gone. In her place was the only person in the city to whom William Thornton truly owed everything. He realized that the debt he owed her couldn't be settled with a check or a scholarship. It required a total dismantling of the man he used to be. The transition from the sterile isolation of the examination room to the hushed, rhythmic pulse of the pediatric intensive care unit felt like crossing between two different universes. William Thornton walked slowly, his gait no longer characterized by the hurried arrogance of a man with a schedule to keep. Beside him, Kesha moved with a hesitant grace, her oversized hospital blanket tucked around her shoulders like a makeshift cape. She walked as if the floor might disappear beneath her, her eyes darting toward the nurses and the expensive machinery with a lingering flick of suspicion. She was used to being told she didn't belong in quiet rooms, but today, the man who owned the building was holding the door open for her. They stopped before a private suite where the lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow. Inside, Benjamin lay in a specialized crib, his chest rising and falling in a steady, beautiful cadence. The red onesie was gone, replaced by a soft hospital gown, and a small oxygen cannula rested beneath his nose, but his color had returned. A healthy, vibrant pink that made the nightmare in the lobby feel like a fever dream. William stepped toward the crib first, his hand trembling as he reached down to stroke the infant's cheek. The baby stirred, his eyes fluttering open, blinking up at the familiar face of his father before his gaze drifted to the girl standing in the doorway. "Come here, Kesha," William whispered, gesturing for her to join them. She approached the side of the crib with the reverence of someone entering a holy site. Benjamin looked at her, his tiny brow furrowing in curiosity. He didn't see the frayed jeans or the dirty t-shirt. He saw the person whose hands had brought the air back into his world. With a soft gurgle, the baby reached out, his small, uncoordinated fingers searching the air until they found Kesha's pinky finger. He gripped it with a surprising, stubborn strength, pulling her hand toward his chest. Kesha's face transformed, the weariness of the streets replaced by a fleeting, radiant smile that made her look like the child she actually was. "He's real strong," she murmured, her voice barely a breath. William watched the two of them, the heir to a multi-billion-dollar legacy and the girl the world had tried to erase, linked by a single tiny hand. The sight of it broke the last of the walls William had built around his heart. He realized that for all his power he had been the one who was truly impoverished, until this girl showed him what it meant to be brave. He turned to Kesha, his expression solemn and heavy with a depth that transcended currency. "I told you earlier that I looked past you and I meant it," he said, his voice echoing softly against the hum of the monitors. "But that ends today. Not just for you, but for the way I see everyone who lives in the shadows of this city." He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, no longer the grip of a security guard or a cold benefactor, but the touch of a man who had finally found his conscience. "You saved my son's life, but you also saved mine. I'm going to make sure you never have to run from a water station again. You and your mother will have a home, an education, and a seat at any table I sit at. You won't be invisible anymore, Kesha. I won't let the world look past you ever again." Kesha looked at the baby, then back at the man who had been a terrifying giant only hours before.
She didn't cry, she simply exhaled, a long, slow breath of relief that seemed to carry away years of fear. As they stood together in the quiet light of the recovery room, the billionaire understood a truth he had never found in a ledger, that the greatest wealth in the world isn't found in what you own, but in the lives you allow yourself to truly see. The debt was repaid, not with money, but with the promise of a future where no child would ever have to be unthinkable just to be heard.